this one with this previous question, and so now we know it's important to do this, that we need to engage students. So generally, what kind of activities would do this? And we don't have to be too specific, because in the next section we'll give some of those specifics. But when we're thinking of the types of things to do, and partially I think maybe what's happening with us is that we have only a few tools in our toolbox, right? Like I've got a hammer and a screwdriver, and if that's all you have, that's all you use, right? But what kind of tools are out there that we could put in our toolbox that are really effective at engaging students?
Well, I think one of the things that I would mention is a previous comment that we mentioned before, and it goes along with the less is more, is the idea that the worst teaching method that you use is the one that you use all the time. And so variety is the spice of teaching life. In one of my classes that's designed more towards educational kind of theory for ministry implications, I hand out a handout called 109 plus teaching methods. And the plus is intentionally put into that handout to encourage students to think that you're only limited by your own effectiveness as a teacher in coming up with different kinds of engaging activities, whatever they may be. And so it's not that it's just limited to 109, but you beg, borrow, you don't steal, but or I guess you must steal.
The best Van Gogh said all art is stealing.
But I mean, but you beg and you borrow. And so, like a common thing that'll happen here on the third floor is we'll joke amongst ourselves. Well, what would Ryan Stark do? Well, he'd put a picture on his handout. Well, what would Tim Anderson do? Well, he'd show a video. Well, what would Sam Baker do? He'll put them into small groups. Or what would, and so on and on. But, so you're always thinking about how can I make this better and more engaging for students? So again, variety is the spice of teaching life. And so, yeah. In a broader general sort of sense, for speaking to that, without speaking to specific activities.
Mm-hmm. Kent,
yeah,
you use the analogy of tools. So you have a hammer and a screwdriver. One of the things you can do is you can go to Lowe's and you can buy a saw. So we look for other tools. So I'm going to see if this works on the screen. I use things like this.
Yeah.
You get it like there it is.
Yeah.
Is that made out of dead trees?
There's lots of books for college faculty. There we go. Smile for the camera. There it is.
Wow. Now we have to pay them a royalty.
It's kind of like walking up and down the aisles of Lowe's and saying, oh, that's a tool I could use. So then, and the nice thing about these Josie Bass publications, they always have a paragraph about using them online. So it's about the face, and then you can turn around and say, well, how can I put this online?
Yeah. Have you used a number of those?
I have.
How has that gone?
I find a lot of great ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's always more to learn. And we've got to be creative so we've got to do some investigation on our own. Sometimes I'll talk to students and I'll ask them, what would you do? How would you approach this content? In education, that's part of what we want them to do, is we want them to think about how to approach content. So it works for our particular purposes. And it's really interesting to see what they do and what they come up with, and having even having them do like broader ideas of analyzing the strategies we do use. Was this effective? And so doing those kinds of conversations where we don't become, again, just that all-knowing expert, but we engage them in ways to approach content that are different. Students can be really creative, and they can actually get really excited about figuring things out with you. So aside, there's a lot of different strategies to go with that, but I pick their brain.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but there's effective strategies in face-to-face, and those effective strategies work in a remote learning as well. And so some of the basic building blocks you have for strategies, like putting them into groups or working with a partner or having them read and respond, just like you would ask a question out loud in class, you do the same components in remote learning. It just is using different tools. So the end goal is still the end goal. And I might have the same strategy, but the tool I use to implement that strategy is going to be a little bit different. In teaching and learning, there's a rhythm that happens. And so as we think about effectively engaging students, there has to be some content or skill at the beginning where you establish a foundation of learning for the students. Maybe it's direct instruction, maybe it's information, it's content that's given to them, and then they do something with it. And they're engaged, whether that's a discussion, whether that's doing an assignment, whether that's just answering a question, whether it's making their own video, own summary, whatever you're having them do. And then you come back to the next thing and you present more content and dig a little deeper or go a different direction. And so there's this consistent rhythm through the whole semester of jumping from, it's almost like playing connect the dots, but going in a circle. You plan to do something, you teach it, they do something with it, you give an assessment, you evaluate how that went, and then that informs what you plan to do next. And so you keep cycling around as you're continually engaging students. What you don't want, back to what Sam said, is to do all of your dump truck of information first. We're going to give you all the content you need for 10 weeks in a row, and now you have 5 weeks to figure out what to do with it. We're going to keep going back and forth through that because, again, that's what keeps students engaged. That piques their curiosity. That piques their creativity. They want to know what's next and how they're going to use what they're learning to do whatever they're going to do. And I think it really is effective for keeping kids plugged in.
So, Aaron, I have a question. Do you think that one way we can keep that rhythm going, like how we can sort of mimic that rhythm of face-to-face that we have online is by deciding purposefully and critically how we want to put content out, number one. So I'm going to put something out on Monday for my class, but I can't just put on Monday. I can't put everything on Monday for the whole week. I need to put something out on Monday, see how they respond as we come back. And I might then add a piece on Wednesday because I want to keep something fresh and something expectant coming. Like I want them to look for the next thing. And if I give them everything on Monday and they read it all on Monday, there's nothing new for a whole week. They've got it out. So I'm wondering if that's one way in which we can mimic that rhythm of face-to-face is by us purposely being more connected by coming in multiple times during that week to add a little bit more, be engaged in this conversation or something like that.
Yeah, and I think, Sam, you probably can jump in with an idea here too. The challenge is the asynchronous, right, of the time that students have in remote learning. And so what you might have to do is spread out how you're doing. If you post something on Monday and then expect students to watch the next thing on Wednesday in a remote learning, that might be unrealistic. But going back to less is more and attention span, I think shorter chunks of information and content delivery, again, at the initial phases of learning where it's more teacher-centric or expert-centric, having it short, concise, targeted, so that then they can interact and do something with it. And then you come back and more. We do this in our classes where it's a 50-minute face-to-face. I don't direct instruct for 45 minutes and then ask questions at the end.
Right.
I go for 10, 15 minutes and then I do a turn and talk, or I do a talk, hey, let me get some feedback of how you're downloading this. And then I'm ready to move on or not. And I think we have to do that same type of thing in a remote learning. The time frame might look different and it gets extended out. But we have to do that to promote student learning. Sam, I guess in your classes, I know you have longer blocks. You talked about that already, where it's like a 10-week instead of a week, a 10-day week. How does that work for you?
Yeah, so in that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I think in one of our questions when we get to weeks, units, or topics and how we handle that. But yeah, when you're thinking about it, again, it's the quality of the engagement or the activity that you're doing with the students. So, I'll give you an example. Most recently, I heard that, and I'm not meaning to like diss anybody on our faculty room, but I heard that some courses were still expected to show up Monday, Wednesday, Friday at their assigned times. And Well, that, and yeah, you can get students to do that. They will do that because you've asked them to do that. But is that really getting at all the objectives, the outcomes, the assessing kinds of things that we're looking for maximizing our engagement with students? Just assuming that we expect them to do something, they will do it because we've asked them to do it, but it may not necessarily achieve the goals that we want. So we're thinking about the design, especially of our activities to engage students. We have to think about time parameters in there as well. Are we giving sufficient time for them to read the material, to reflect on the material, to engage with others in discussion on the material, and then have some sort of summative sort of evaluation of that or whatever? Well, that takes time. And so a week may not necessarily get it done. So I have courses that I break up into 10-day units rather than a 5-day, typical work week. And students have, got back and thank you so much. Now, it's not that, hey, I'm letting you off the hook by providing less, but they're more engaged, and the quality of engagement, it goes off the charts as far as the way in which they're actually participating in the class. So yeah, it just kind of depends.
How often do you think, Sam, that you are in that class in that 10-day period where even if you're just checking in to look at progress, or you're making a comment like, hey, I really like how the forum's going, keep up the good discussion, like you don't have to get real teachy on it, but how often do you think you're in there in that 10 days?
Well, and again, it depends on the class and the nature of the class. So some classes I may do a daily check-in just because of the nature of it and the kind of engagement that I'm asking from them. Other kinds of courses that I teach, like our supervised leadership experience, these people are, the hard work is them out in the field doing the field work, meeting with their mentors and their supervisors and those kinds of things. So I don't have to check in as frequently with them because they have other engagement points. So it really depends on the type of class and the structure of the class as to how much you're actually engaging as the faculty member with that. So it could be every day, or it may be once a week, typically, whatever it may be. But the point is making sure that you're connecting.
Yeah.
You have some, it's not only students who go off the grid and are MIA.
Yeah.
But faculty have done that too. So, and that's
and it's amazing how fast. It's kind of like dog years, that go. It's a different sort of time frame. It's kind of like online weeks seem to be greatly accelerated. And Jen, you probably, as an online student, it's like I've taken online classes before, and you just never catch your breath because you're just constantly going. And after I took an online class, I now sort of build in every 3 weeks, like some intentional, just kind of downtime a little bit. Let's catch up. Let's catch our breath a little bit, and then we'll push forward. But it feels like you're in a sprint/marathon sometimes. And
I know that weekends are the most important time for an online student in a lot of ways, because they're trying to gather all these things during the week and be engaged in things and getting pieces done as they can. But having weekends for due dates is huge. So if something is due on Monday or Sunday night at 11 p.m. versus, Thursday or Friday is really helpful. If we're asking students to digest a lot and do a lot of processing on their own time as well, kind of giving them that space. And so with that question, I was just really getting back to, we need to be cognizant of our own pacing in the online world of our pacing of engagement actually helps our course move and stay feeling current and relevant along the way, I think.
Yeah. And don't get ahead of them. Because it is easy for them to feel just, like, oh, I'm just so far behind now. I'm just done. And then they'll just jump off ship. And so that rhythm is really tough because you want them to have a quality experience, but you also want them to survive and have a life. And so here's another question.
About the craft of teaching.
Yeah.
I was just going to say what Jen said, described was really about the craft of teaching, the ability, whether you're online or face-to-face, to read your students, how well they're engaged, are they keeping up, and to be able to, as a teacher, to adjust to make sure that you're together.